She slapped a black woman in first class, not knowing she was the billionaire who owned the entire jet. She bought the plane, but they still thought she didn't belong on it. A billionaire black woman, slapped in first class. Questioned, dismissed, humiliated, not because she lacked power, but because some still can't see past skin. But what happens when the one they try to silence owns the microphone? This isn't just about a seat on a plane. It's about every room that was never made for us until we walked in. And today, she's not walking out quietly. She's changing the system that let it happen. Stay with this story. You won't believe what comes next. The seat that started a fire. The sun fell low that afternoon, painting streaks of gold across the tarmac. The jet sat waiting, sleek, private, untouchable. It shimmered like a symbol, not just of wealth, but of separation. Of who gets to feel above the clouds and who's expected to stay grounded. Inside, everything was hushed perfection, cream leather, brass trim, a scent of polished wood and perfume so faint only money could afford it. Passengers moved like they belonged there, like this kind of peace had always been theirs. Then Naomi Williams stepped on board. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. Her presence was quiet, so quiet it commanded attention. She wore a navy blazer cut just right, slacks that moved like silk, and shoes polished enough to reflect the faces of those watching her walk down the aisle. Her skin was the color of mahogany kissed by sun. Her hair coiled and smoothed back into a tight, dignified bun. She didn't smile, she didn't frown. She just walked with the kind of stillness that made people notice, though they couldn't quite explain why. Lauren noticed. The lead flight attendant had been greeting everyone with warmth. Her voice sugar-sweet to the Raymonds in first row, her posture relaxed and poised for polite conversation. But the moment Naomi approached, something cold slipped across Lauren's face. Her smile dimmed, her posture stiffened. She looked Naomi up and down once, and just once was enough. "Welcome aboard," she said flatly, no warmth. No eye contact. Naomi gave a slight nod. She didn't need more. She moved toward her seat, second row, left window. Her bag was small, neatly tucked beneath her feet. Her posture was composed, upright, almost regal. She didn't look around. She didn't have to. She knew eyes were following her. Lauren's did. Her eyes narrowed slightly, jaw tight, as she pretended to fuss with a clipboard. Then she walked over. "Excuse me," she said, smiling, but only with her mouth. "I believe you're in the wrong seat." Naomi looked up. Her voice, when it came, was smooth, steady, almost soft. "No, this is my seat." Lauren's lips twitched. Her tone stayed light, but something underneath it sharpened. "This section's reserved for our elite passengers," she said. "I understand," Naomi replied, her eyes never leaving Lauren S. "You may want to check the list." Lauren didn't flinch. She didn't check anything. Instead, she folded her arms and let her smile fade. "I know who belongs in this cabin," she said, "and I know who doesn't." Across the aisle, a businessman stirred in his seat. In the next row, a socialite leaned slightly forward, pretending not to listen, but listening anyway. Naomi didn't blink. "Then maybe check again," she said. The air in the cabin thinned. Lauren's voice rose just slightly, enough for others to hear. "I'm going to ask you one last time. Move to the back of the plane, or I'll call security." Naomi's hands remained still in her lap. "I've already told you, I'm not moving." Her voice was velvet, but it held iron beneath it. The socialite raised her eyebrows. The businessman shifted. Someone whispered, "Why doesn't she just go?" But Naomi stayed seated, not with defiance, with dignity. Lauren turned, stalking down the aisle. Every step of her heels hit the carpet like judgment. And Naomi sat there, quiet, calm, still. But in that stillness was something electric, something that said, this was not going to end the way Lauren thought it would. Not today. Not on this plane. And definitely not with the woman she had just tried to humiliate in front of the sky. Flight attendant slaps black woman, everyone goes silent. The cabin wasn't loud, but the silence was suddenly different. It wasn't peaceful, it was tight. Like something was pulling the air thinner with every second Naomi refused to move. She sat there, spine straight, face calm, but her chest was carrying a familiar weight, the one only black folks know too well. That quiet knowledge that you're being watched not for who you are, but for what they think you are. Lauren hovered nearby, pacing with short, angry steps. Her lips pressed tight, her clipboard now just a prop in her hands. "I'm not going to ask again," she said. Her voice was loud now. Loud enough that even the champagne sippers in row 4 stopped mid-toast. "If you don't move to the back, I'll have security drag you out." Naomi didn't raise her voice. "You can call whoever you need to," she said, her tone steady. "But I'm not moving." Across the aisle, a woman in pearls leaned into her husband. "She's really not moving." The husband shook his head. "She must be confused. People do this to get upgrades." Another voice behind them whispered, "She's probably just pretending. That's not her seat." Naomi heard it all, every word. But she didn't react. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was endurance. Lauren stormed off and came back with a tray of water. She didn't look at Naomi, not even once. She offered drinks to every passenger around her, everyone except Naomi. Naomi waited, gave it a moment. Then spoke, voice soft but clear. "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" Lauren didn't even stop. "I'll get to you when I can." And just like that, she walked away. Not one passenger said a word, but some averted their eyes. Others, still whispering, still watching. Naomi leaned back, closed her eyes for a second. It wasn't the first time she'd been dismissed. But this time was louder, more public, and that made it harder to swallow. Then she shifted. Just a small motion. She stretched one leg slightly into the aisle, trying to get more comfortable. Lauren turned back up, tray still in hand, her steps quick. And then, it happened. The tray slammed forward. Water crashed over Naomi's lap, splashing her pants, her seat, the floor. Gasps filled the cabin. "Oh my God," someone whispered. Lauren threw her hands up. "Watch where you're putting your legs," she snapped. Naomi froze, her hands wet. Her pants soaked, her dignity dripping with every drop of cold water running down her thighs. "I wasn't moving," Naomi said, voice still low. "You walked into me." Lauren didn't apologize. Instead, she took a step closer. And in one motion, quick, sharp, reckless, she raised her hand and slapped Naomi across the face. The sound was soft, but the silence that followed, explosive. No one moved, no one breathed. The businessman near the window dropped his phone. The nosy woman in pearls sat bolt upright, her mouth open. Grace, the junior attendant, clutched the wall. Her hands trembled. Naomi slowly straightened. She didn't touch her face. She didn't blink. But she looked Lauren in the eye and said with surgical precision, "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Lauren's breath caught. She tried to speak, but no sound came. Naomi turned her head slowly to face the rest of the cabin. Her eyes met theirs, every passenger, every silent witness. Their eyes, once judgmental or indifferent, now wide with disbelief, maybe shame. She looked at no one in particular, and yet she looked at all of them. Then she said, "This is what happens when you assume people don't belong." The pilot hadn't stepped out yet. Security hadn't been called. But in that moment, power had shifted, not in volume, not in noise, but in truth. Lauren took a step back. Naomi picked up her phone, typed something, set it down, didn't say a word. But her silence roared through the cabin louder than any storm, and everyone, especially Lauren, knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Black woman sits silent after slap. Then everything starts to change. The cabin didn't breathe. Not a whisper, not a shuffle, not even the soft clink of glass. It was as if time itself had frozen in the shockwave of the slap. Naomi's face, still turned slightly from the impact, remained motionless. The red bloom on her cheek stood out against her skin like a scar written by injustice itself. But her eyes didn't burn, they didn't weep, they focused. Steady, still, she slowly turned to look at Lauren. The quiet in her gaze was no longer calm. It was confrontation without raising a single decibel. The kind of silence that speaks from generations of people who have learned that the loudest power is the one that never lowers itself to rage. Lauren took a small step back, as if suddenly realizing she had crossed into territory she could no longer control. Naomi sat straighter, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't touch her cheek. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. The other passengers, those who had just moments ago whispered about her presence, now looked down at their laps. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Grace, the junior flight attendant, stood frozen near the cockpit wall. Her hands gripped the clipboard so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She had witnessed it all. The microaggressions, the escalation, the slap, and still no one moved. Then Naomi reached for her phone. It wasn't dramatic. There was no rush, no trembling, no expression to warn what was coming next. She typed, pressed send, set it gently beside her. Lauren watched the movement like someone watching the lighting of a fuse. "What are you doing?" Her voice cracked with something she hadn't shown all day, uncertainty. Naomi looked at her, voice quiet. "You'll find out soon enough." Behind them, the businessman who had been silent far too long finally stood all the way up. "This is unacceptable," he said. "Are we really allowing this?" Lauren turned on him, reaching for authority. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stay in your seat." He didn't move. "What you're going to have to do is explain to everyone why that woman was just assaulted in front of us. Because if you don't, I will." His voice wasn't raised either. But it rang like justice long delayed. Lauren's mouth opened, but the words got caught. Then, from the front of the cabin, the cockpit door opened. The pilot stepped out. His face was pale, his expression unreadable, but his walk had purpose. He approached Lauren directly. "I need you to step aside," he said firmly. Lauren blinked. "Excuse me?" The pilot didn't flinch. "I've just received a call from operations. The owner of the aircraft is on board." He turned slightly. "Miss Naomi Williams." He said it with care, not like a discovery, but like a confirmation. Gasps rippled through the cabin. Audible, staggered. Grace covered her mouth. The businessman exhaled slowly, like he'd suspected it all along. Lauren stood frozen. "That can't be true." The pilot kept his voice even. "It is. She owns this jet, and she owns the airline." A wave of silence crashed over the cabin, heavier than the first. Naomi didn't move, didn't blink, she just watched. Lauren stammered. There must be a mistake, there must be some confusion. The pilot turned fully to Naomi. "Miss Williams, how would you like us to proceed?" Naomi looked down for a moment, then up. With the quiet authority of a woman who had nothing to prove, but everything to say. "I would like her removed from this aircraft immediately." Lauren's body stiffened. "Please, I didn't know." Naomi's eyes were calm, but they held fire now. "You didn't know because you didn't care to look." She stood. Her posture untouched by the chaos, her presence more commanding now than ever before. The slap had marked her skin, but her dignity, untouched, unshaken, rising. And every person in that cabin finally realized she had never needed to prove she belonged. They were the ones who had to answer why they thought she didn't. Flight crew learns the truth. She's not just a passenger. The cabin door opened without warning. Outside, the tarmac shimmered under the sun. A black SUV had pulled up beside the jet, sleek, polished, quiet. Its doors swung open, and out stepped two figures dressed in tailored, dark suits. They walked with intention. No hesitation. No wasted motion. Inside the plane, the air was still thick with disbelief. Lauren stood near the galley, her hands tight around her clipboard like it was a lifeline. Her face had lost color, but her jaw stayed clenched as if she could hold onto control by sheer force. She watched as the two assistants entered the aircraft and moved straight to Naomi, bypassing everyone else. "Miss Williams," one of them said, their voice warm and composed, "everything is ready for your review." The way they said it wasn't performative, it was practiced, it was real. Gasps echoed again. The socialite covered her mouth. "She owns the plane." The businessman only nodded as if he'd suspected it long before this moment. Naomi stood, her blazer smooth and dry now, her chin held high. The quiet around her wasn't fear, it was respect. Earned, commanded, unshakable. She turned slowly toward Lauren, whose eyes had dropped to the floor. For the first time all day, she looked small, not because of her height, but because the truth had exposed her. Lauren tried to speak. "Miss Williams, I didn't know, I'm so sorry." Naomi's expression didn't change. "You didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't ask because you thought you already had the answer." Her voice was low, but it carried through the cabin with undeniable strength. "You looked at me and made a decision, without a word, without a question. Just based on what you saw." Lauren opened her mouth, but Naomi continued. "You didn't think I belonged here, and even if I hadn't owned this plane, that still wouldn't make what you did right." A ripple moved through the cabin, soft nods, shifting posture, eyes cast down in shame. Naomi took one step closer. "You embarrassed me. You denied me service. You assaulted me in front of every witness here, and you did it with pride. That's not ignorance, that's arrogance." Lauren's voice shook. It was a misunderstanding. No, Naomi's voice didn't rise, but it landed like thunder. It was a reflection of your bias, and your bias just ended your career. The captain reappeared, standing by the cockpit door. His stance was firm. His voice, this time, was decisive. "Miss Williams, per your request, we're removing Ms. Lauren from this flight, and we'll be filing a formal incident report to the airline board." Lauren's clipboard slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Please don't do this." Naomi's eyes remained steady. "This isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility." From the rear of the cabin, Grace stepped forward, hesitant at first, but with purpose in her voice. "I saw everything, and I just want to say you didn't deserve any of it." Naomi turned to her and offered the smallest nod of gratitude. "You stood back when you were told to, but you didn't support what happened. That matters." She turned to one of her assistants. "Make sure her name reaches HR. She deserves better than this place." Lauren, now trembling, looked around the cabin. The same people she once treated with casual friendliness now avoided her gaze. The power she thought she had, gone. It hadn't been real. It had only ever been borrowed. Two security officers boarded the plane. One addressed Lauren directly. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." Lauren looked one last time at Naomi, desperation in her voice. "Please, I didn't mean to." Naomi met her eyes without blinking. "You didn't mean to get caught, but now you have." Lauren was escorted down the aisle, her shoes clicking against the floor. The silence she left behind was the loudest sound the cabin had heard all day. Naomi remained standing. Her assistant leaned toward her. "Would you like to deplane now, Miss Williams?" Naomi looked around the space. "No. Let's finish the flight." And just like that, she sat back down, in the seat that had always been hers. But now everyone finally saw her the way she'd always carried herself, not just as a passenger, as the power behind the wings. Passengers watch in awe as she turns disrespect into reform. The hum of the engines returned to its usual rhythm, but something inside the cabin had changed. It wasn't just quieter, it was clearer. A stillness that wasn't empty but full of awareness. The kind that only arrives after truth has spoken so loudly, even silence feels like an echo. Naomi sat back in her seat, her posture still perfect, her face still calm. The slap mark was gone, but what remained was more powerful than any bruise. It was presence, a presence that didn't need validation, because now there was no denying who she was, not just the owner of the plane, but a woman who had drawn a line without ever raising her voice. The socialite turned to her husband, her voice barely above a whisper. I judged her. I did. Her husband nodded slowly, his expression tight with shame. We all did. Across the aisle, the businessman leaned forward again. Miss Williams, if I may, what you did back there, the way you handled it, that was the definition of grace under fire. Naomi didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Thank you. But this isn't just about me. He waited, giving her space to finish. This is about every black traveler who's been followed in a store, questioned in a hotel lobby, or treated like they don't belong in spaces their money paid for. Today it was me. Tomorrow it could be your daughter, or your colleague, or your neighbor. She paused, then added. So maybe now we start choosing better. A few rows behind, Grace sat with her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes welled up as she replayed the day in her mind. She had hesitated when it mattered most, but she had also spoken up. Naomi had seen that, and she hadn't forgotten. The captain returned to the intercom. His voice was measured but sincere. Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to continue this flight with you today. Please let this moment remind us all to treat each other with the same dignity we expect for ourselves. Thank you for your patience. The message wasn't just for passengers, it was for the industry. Naomi gazed out the window as the clouds drifted by, endless and white, glowing like possibility. But she wasn't looking at scenery. She was looking at legacy. Her assistant leaned in. There's been a statement request from the media. What would you like us to say? Naomi's answer came without hesitation. Tell them respect isn't a privilege, it's a right. And from this day forward, my company will lead by example. Back on the ground, the story was already moving. Social media had picked it up. Hashtags bloomed like wildflowers in spring. Dignity in the sky, Naomi Williams. Respect has no color, but Naomi didn't care about going viral. She cared about what came after. Later, after the flight landed, she stepped onto the tarmac not as a victim, but as a leader. Reporters stood waiting by the terminal. Cameras flashed, but Naomi didn't rush. She didn't hide. One journalist stepped forward. Miss Williams, what would you say to those who still believe you were just overreacting? She looked at the reporter with a steady calm. I'd say this. If speaking up for your own humanity feels like overreacting to someone, then maybe they've never had to fight to be seen as human in the first place. And with that, she walked forward, not just into the terminal, but into history. She turns a moment of disrespect into a global wake-up call. The sun dipped low as the jet eased into its descent, casting gold over the clouds like they were dipped in justice. Naomi sat motionless in seat 1A, the city slowly emerging below, but her mind was elsewhere. The hum of the engines wasn't what she heard anymore. It was the murmur of change that had begun to ripple from her silence. Her phone lit up quietly on the armrest. Hundreds of notifications. Messages from attorneys, leaders, celebrities, strangers from around the world, all echoing the same message. We saw you. We believe you. We needed that. Naomi didn't smile, not yet, because this wasn't about applause. It was about awakening. Grace approached her softly, her steps careful, her voice steady. Miss Williams, I know this may not be the time, but I want to thank you. Naomi looked up. For what? For not letting it go, for not shrinking, for reminding people like me that silence isn't safety. Naomi studied her. The young woman looked like someone caught between fear and courage, like she'd seen both sides of the system and was deciding which one to serve. You made a mistake by staying quiet, but you corrected it. That matters more than pretending you didn't. Grace's eyes glistened. I've worked flights for 3 years. I've seen this happen before, just never to someone powerful enough to fight back. Naomi nodded slowly. Then make sure it never happens again, even when no one's watching. Grace nodded. Yes, ma'am. The jet's wheels touched down. The cabin applauded out of habit, but this time it sounded different, like a collective exhale. Naomi stood before the seatbelt sign even blinked off. Her assistant handed her a folder. Here's the internal HR statement. Do you want to change anything before it goes public? Naomi opened the folder and scanned the lines quickly. She paused. Take this out, she said. The part that says, we regret the misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was discrimination. Change it to say we are committing to mandatory bias and equity training across all departments. And I want every employee to know, silence will cost them. Her assistant nodded and tapped the update. As Naomi stepped off the plane, cameras waited, but this time they weren't flashing to capture luxury. They were catching a woman who had turned humiliation into reform. A reporter stepped forward. Miss Williams, what's next? Naomi adjusted her blazer, then looked straight into the lens. Next, I want every person who has ever felt invisible in a luxury space to know they were never the problem. The system is, and we're rewriting it. She kept walking. Past the cameras, past the questions, past the eyes that had once looked down on her and now couldn't look away. She didn't need revenge. She had something better. A platform. And this time she was using it not to rise alone, but to pull an entire people up beside her. Her words echo across boardrooms, changing everything they ignored. In a downtown glass tower lined with mahogany walls and leather seats, the boardroom grew uncomfortably still. A wide screen flickered to life at the head of the table, showing Naomi Williams walking calmly across the tarmac after the flight. The executives watched in silence, each one caught between discomfort and disbelief. She never raised her voice, said the VP of Operations quietly. Not once. The head of public relations shifted in her seat, and still every major outlet is running her name. Every comment section is on fire. This isn't just a PR problem. This is a leadership reckoning. In that moment, every face around the table turned toward the man at the center, the CEO. His fingers tapped slowly on the polished wood. Schedule the emergency press conference. Not tomorrow, tonight. Meanwhile, Naomi stood in front of a different camera, one she controlled, a quiet studio, no flashing lights. Just her voice, steady and low, rising like a storm without thunder. I didn't want to become a symbol, she began. I wanted to enjoy a flight. I wanted to be respected for what I paid for, not questioned because of what I looked like. Her eyes looked directly into the lens. But when silence became violence, I had a choice, shrink or stand. She paused. I stood. Her words moved across the country like wildfire. Screens lit up in salons, classrooms, churches, barbershops, living rooms. A young black boy watched from a small apartment in Detroit. She looks like my mom. A teacher in Atlanta stopped mid-lesson and replayed the clip. This is what we mean when we say representation matters. In the airline's headquarters, employees streamed the video at their desks. Some stared in guilt. Others nodded in quiet agreement. For many, it was the first time they'd heard someone in power speak their language without code. Later that evening, the press conference began. The CEO stepped up to the podium, tie tight, posture tense. We failed. The words dropped like stones. We failed to uphold the values we claim to stand for. We allowed bias to speak louder than decency. And we will not let it go uncorrected. He announced sweeping reforms. Mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. A restructured complaint process. A new executive role, Chief Equity Officer. And most notably, a public partnership with Naomi Williams, foundation focused on equity in travel. Naomi didn't attend the conference. She didn't need to. She was already doing something more important. In a conference room across town, she met with a room full of young black interns, new hires entering the travel industry. She stood in front of them not as a victim, not even as a billionaire, but as proof that you don't have to shout to be heard, you just have to know your worth. One intern raised her hand. "Miss Williams, how did you stay calm?" When she slapped you, Naomi smiled gently, her eyes holding weight, because my value doesn't change just because someone else refuses to see it. The room fell quiet. Then slowly applause began. Not the kind of applause given to celebrities, but the kind reserved for people who do something that shifts the entire air around you. Naomi looked at them, her voice steady. "You are not here to ask for space. You are here to take up the space that's already yours." And for the first time in a long time, she felt something deeper than pride. She felt the tide turning, not just for her, but for every black traveler who ever sat in seat 1A and wondered if the world would ever catch up. Black woman tells her story on live TV, stuns the nation. She sits calmly on national television, but her words resound like thunder. The lights in the studio were soft but unforgiving. Every angle had been rehearsed, every camera set. But nothing could prepare the producers for what was about to unfold when Naomi Williams walked onto that stage. She didn't arrive with an entourage. No security detail. No glam team, just her, dressed in ivory, no logos. No jewelry, just grace, just truth. The host, a well-known journalist, greeted her with a handshake that lingered longer than usual. "Thank you for being here, Miss Williams," Naomi nodded. "Thank you for inviting me." Though I didn't come for attention, I came for accountability. The broadcast cut to a wide shot. Across the country, living rooms fell quiet. Airports froze mid-announcement. Phones dimmed as viewers leaned in. The host wasted no time. "You've remained mostly silent since the incident. Why speak now?" Naomi's hands were folded in her lap. Her voice didn't rise or fall. It simply flowed, measured, honest, deliberate. Because it's not just my story. It's the story of every person who's ever walked into a room and been told without words, "You don't belong here." The host leaned forward. "But you do belong. You own the airline. You built an empire." Naomi looked directly into the camera. "Privilege doesn't protect us from prejudice. It never has. I didn't get slapped because I lacked power. I got slapped because she didn't see my humanity." There was a pause so heavy the room seemed to hold its breath. "And what about forgiveness?" "Do you forgive her?" Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Forgiveness is for the heart, but accountability is for the soul of a system. If I forgive her personally, that's one thing. But if I stay quiet, the system learns nothing." And silence. That's complicity. Social media lit up in real time. Comments poured in. Screenshots shared. Hashtags surged. The host continued. "What do you say to those who call this an isolated mistake?" Naomi's eyes narrowed, but her tone stayed even. "It's only isolated if you've never lived it. For many of us, this is Tuesday. This is boarding a plane, shopping in a store, walking into a meeting. Being black in spaces built to keep you out doesn't stop hurting just because you have money." One of the producers behind the camera wiped a tear from her cheek. The sound booth operator took off his headset and whispered, "This is different." And Naomi was just getting started. "I'm not here because I need a spotlight. I have power. I have wealth. But what I want, what I fight for, is for the little girl watching this from a small apartment with her mother, wondering if she's allowed to dream of first class. She should know she doesn't have to become a billionaire to deserve respect. The host was quiet for a moment. Then, in a rare, unscripted moment, he said softly, "You make me want to be better." Naomi looked at him, gentle but direct. Then start at your dinner table. Start in your hiring decisions. Start with what you allow your silence to protect. The audience in the studio didn't clap. They didn't move. They sat in the stillness of her truth. In the weight of centuries that had been spoken with fewer than 100 words, the host cleared his throat. "Miss Williams' last question. What's next for you?" Naomi exhaled, looked down, then back up. "I'll keep building, but not just buildings. I'll build people. I'll build policies. I'll build systems that don't ask black children to be extraordinary just to be seen as equal." She stood, and as she walked off the stage, not a single person in the room moved. Because when dignity walks, the world watches. And when black women speak, truth doesn't just echo, it rebuilds the walls it once hit. Black woman returns to the sky and everything feels different. When she steps on board again, the world that once judged now stands. The tarmac shimmered beneath the morning sun, stretching wide like a new page waiting to be written. A sleek jet stood in position, engines quiet, stairs down, cabin door open. Everything about it mirrored the last flight. Same airline, same aircraft model, same crisp wind curling around the terminal. But this time, everything felt different. Naomi Williams stepped out of the black SUV, alone. No cameras, no entourage, just her long coat flowing gently behind her like a flag that had been carried through fire and still refused to fall. She held no phone, no agenda in hand. This was a personal flight, one she had booked not as a statement but as a return. She climbed the stairs slowly, step by step, her heels clicking against the steel. Each sound echoed with memory. With grace, with something more than victory, closure. At the top, the flight attendant was already waiting. A black woman, younger but poised. Her uniform crisp, her posture straight, her eyes bright with quiet respect. "Welcome aboard, Miss Williams." Naomi paused, looked her in the eye, and smiled. "Thank you." The cabin was nearly empty. Only a few other passengers, most of them glancing up from their seats as she entered. But not a single stare lingered with doubt. Not a single eye questioned her presence. They knew who she was, but more importantly, they understood what she had stood for. She made her way to seat 1A again. But this time, it didn't feel like a seat that had to be earned. It felt like a seat that had always been hers. As Naomi settled in, the attendant approached again. "Would you care for a drink before takeoff? Just water, thank you, of course." "And if I may," she said softly, "I watched your interview last week. I've worked flights for years. And what you did, it gave us all a little more space to breathe." Naomi looked up, her voice warm. "That's why I did it." The attendant returned moments later with water on a tray lined with a folded white cloth. She didn't place it hurriedly. She didn't walk away. She stood there just a second longer than protocol required, honoring the moment. Then returned to her duties. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to have you with us today. And it is a particular honor to welcome back one of our own passengers who continues to inspire both our crew and our company." Naomi didn't shift. She just looked out the window at the rising light. Across the aisle, a little black girl sat next to her mother, legs too short to touch the floor. She peeked at Naomi, eyes wide and wondering. The mother leaned over and whispered something. The girl nodded, then smiled shyly. Naomi smiled back, then reached into her bag, pulled out a notepad, scribbled a message, tore the page, and handed it to the little girl with a wink. The girl read it slowly, lips moving silently. "You belong in every room, never forget that." The flight lifted gently off the runway. And as the clouds swallowed the earth below, Naomi sat quiet, knowing this wasn't just about reclaiming a seat. It was about rewriting what the sky meant for people who had always been told to stay grounded. This time, she wasn't just flying. She was leading. Her legacy blooms in the next generation. A young black girl stands where Naomi once did, but now she's ready. The stage was small. The lights weren't bright, but the room was full, rows of folding chairs, proud parents. Teachers dabbing tears. A mural behind the podium showed a black woman in flight, arms outstretched, not falling but rising. Beneath it, bold letters read, Naomi Williams Leadership Academy. At the center stood a young girl in a navy blazer, no older than 10. Her braids tied with gold ribbon. Her eyes steady, voice clear. Last year I met someone who made me feel seen. I was just a girl on a plane. But she gave me a note that said, you belong in every room. The crowd went quiet. Now I want to be that person for someone else. I want to build places where we don't have to ask for respect. It just meets us there. In the back of the room, Naomi sat quietly. No cameras, no headlines, just her and the echo of something greater than applause, the echo of seeds planted, the sound of legacy. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathed in the soft hum of children dreaming out loud, and smiled. This wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of another. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin not with noise, but with dignity, courage, and the refusal to be small in a world that tries to shrink you. Naomi's story reminds us that true strength isn't always loud. It's steady. It's principled. It's choosing to rise with grace even when you're pushed down. Let this be a reminder to us all. Every act of quiet resistance matters. Every moment of kindness, every stand for justice, and every voice that speaks for those still unheard creates ripples we may never see, but the world will feel. If this story moved you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of Naomi's journey spoke to you the most? And don't forget, this is just one of many stories we'll be sharing. In the next videos, we'll uncover more untold stories of Black resilience, quiet power, bold breakthroughs, and deeply moving moments of truth that the world has overlooked for far too long. Stay with us. The next story might just change the way you see everything.